Thank you. So we're just moving from one hard topic to the next. It's impossible to talk and think about technology and its broad role driving the economy, affecting social health without feeling that the topic's a bit slippery, right? I mean, sort of when are you talking about regulation? When are you talking about how capital operates? When are you talking about civil society forces? I think one theme of this conference is that market, public sector, and civil society are all relevant to each of the questions that we're thinking about. And if the last panel was really about some of the drivers of our collective social experience and the structure of the economy, I think this panel is actually about some of the goals. But it's a bit different, I think, to think about the goal in terms of questions of family and migration. Migration is really a kind of extension of the question of family because typically it's families that move in various ways, sort of linked groups of people who are moving. And if we take those two themes together, we're really asking a question about the future social fabric of any given country, the US, since that's our primary focus right now. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that the way you knew a society was flourishing was simply if the population was growing. And there was a point in time when that was a kind of conventional way of thinking about collective social well-being. I think at this point, folks on the right are more comfortable thinking about the health of families and so forth, for example, as a measure of how well a society is doing. I think that's harder on the left. And yet I think that's a kind of conversation that we need somehow to bring together. So the goal of this panel is to both surface the kinds of questions that people are pursuing when they think about the health of the family or think about questions of migration and the like. And we'll hear several different perspectives for sure. I myself, I don't think I have a particularly good analytical frame, ultimately, for exactly how all these themes link up, although we heard already earlier in the day that sort of every single panel, the ways in which issues of migration and labor and the family just kept circling around together, right, with kind of care at the center of that circle. So we're all really still looking for our analytical frameworks, I think, in order to understand this. So we'll do some work on it now, for the coming hour with the help of everybody here and with all of your good help in the questions. I won't promise that we'll get to any solutions, but we are certainly doing our best. Our panel today is different than in your program because this is where we did get hit by the viral gods and so forth. And so I'm very grateful to two colleagues who've stepped in at the last minute to replace people who had health issues that kept them away. But so first here next to me is Brad Littlejohn, Director of Programs and Education at American Compass. Then next to him, my colleague in the government department here at Harvard, Alicia Holland, who is a specialist and expert on comparative politics, Latin America, but also questions of migration and the economy. Next to Alicia, Luma Sims, who is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And then Anne-Marie Slaughter, whom you met previously, who is the president and CEO of New America. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining me. And I am going to sort of start off with a pretty big, just open framing question so that everybody can share their sort of way of thinking about these linked problems. I've asked each panelist to share what they take to be the most important aspects of how the American social fabric is changing and what they take to be the most pressing question we collectively need to answer about how we support healthy families and/or think about migration.
Thank you, Danielle. Pleasure to be here. I would suggest possibly as an analytical framework, a theme that came up in some of the early sessions, which is the importance of recovering boundaries. And perhaps neoliberalism was defined above all by its attack on boundaries of every kind. And a successful solution to the problem of migration requires reassertion of national boundaries. A successful family policy requires a reassertion of family boundaries. And my own interest is at the intersection of tech policy and family policy. And I would say the biggest challenge that is facing America today is family breakdown. Now, not in the sense that people usually use that term, like the breakdown of individual families through divorce. That is a problem. But I would say we have the breakdown of the family as such, which is to say the family as the social unit that is responsible for limiting the flow of information to children. Neil Postman argues in his book, Disappearance of Childhood, that the critical civilizational function of the family is to restrict the access to information to children so that they only have information, they're not overwhelmed by information that they're not prepared for. And Hannah Arendt similarly argues in The Human Condition that the family plays this critical role of protecting this private walled-off space so that citizens are able to grow up into responsible adults capable of public deliberation. So today, the average American child receives a smartphone at age 11. And perhaps not coincidentally, the average American child accesses hardcore pornography also at age 11. So we live in a society where children are at home more than they've ever been. It's a problem. Teens don't get driver's licenses anymore. But when they're at home, they're more likely to be spending time talking to, receiving information from complete strangers. So we've dissolved the walls of the household, dissolved the boundaries of the family, and we're reaping the fruit in the form of a very anxious generation, as Jonathan Haidt has argued. Now, yesterday, if you were a 14-year-old in Australia, you received a notification from Instagram saying that you would no longer be able to log into your account for 2 years. Australia passed, I think, the world's first large-scale social media ban for under 16s. And I would argue this is a big stroke of family policy, because tech policy is the new family policy. Now, why did it take so long for Australia to do this? It's been, we've had social media for 15 years. We've known about its harms for a long time. Why have we not done this in the United States? Well, I would say part of the problem is there's a conspiracy, an inadvertent conspiracy of both left and right here, right? So the right has been guilty of a market fundamentalism that has refused to question the ways that tech companies make their money, even if those profits are gained at the cost of the breakdown of the family, which conservatives claim to hold dear. The left, while it has liked to posture as a critic of those corporations that are reaping these enormous profits, has, I think, conspired to increase their profits by dissolving the authority of families and subjecting families to market logic. So today, in battles over laws for age verification for pornography and social media, the biggest opposition is likely to come from progressives who say, well, look, there are some LGBT plus youth who need access to information about their sexual identity that their traditionalist parents might not be willing to give them. And so we need to give them this unrestricted access. Now, I would say sometimes parents do abuse their authority as information gatekeepers, right? But, as the scholastics say, abusus non tollit usum. Conservatives have always understood that politics involves trade-offs, and that means accepting that sometimes young people will be overly sheltered. But I think the risk of some young people somewhere being overly sheltered is a price we should be willing to pay in a world where 11-year-olds get hooked on hardcore porn and 14-year-old girls get bombarded with beauty ads on Instagram whenever the algorithm shows that they are feeling down about their appearance. I would love to live in a world, again, where we actually had to worry about the problem of too many kids being too sheltered. So I think the most pressing question for us to answer as a society is it possible to restore to families and then also to churches and schools and other communities their critical civilizational role as information gatekeepers?
Great, thank you. Alicia.
Great. So when I first saw Danielle's description of this panel, I thought, this is the afternoon smorgasbord. These themes make no sense together. We've got family, migration, health. But what I want to do is first just step back and think about the ways that really our immigration system has fundamentally shaped how we raise families in the United States. So the neoliberal era was very much about a period of high levels of low-skilled immigration, at least in the United States. Now, what this allowed, obviously, was a huge expansion of service economies. So 40% of our childcare workers are immigrants. 50% of our elder care workers are immigrants. We can think about the expansion of things also like the way that we get food for our families. I asked my daughter tonight, do you want Indian food or Thai food while I'm out at this event? I never was asked that question as a kid. I didn't have Thai food till college. Yet the expansion of the restaurant industry means that we can now think of ordering takeout for our families, where probably the person who's going to deliver your food is an immigrant. So what this means is that we've seen an incredible marketization of the family. Cheap labor, immigrant labor, has allowed for a certain middle-class way of raising families that depends on market transactions. I can hire childcare. I can hire a restaurant to bring Thai food to my family. I can also depend on, when my parents get sick, having a home care aide come to my parents. This was the neoliberal model. Now, there are many issues with that model that we all recognize. First of all, the huge inequalities. I'm describing a middle-class model of raising a family. Obviously, those who cannot afford and actually work in these service jobs still rely on family, neighbors, friends, et cetera, to sustain care. We can also imagine that there are many critiques that this is an atomized view of how to raise families. It's the fundamental problem of the market. I'm transacting with providers. That means that I'm not asking my neighbor to keep an eye on my kid or to make sure that, she doesn't just eat candy for dinner tonight. That's a very disheartening, lonely way to raise families. Now, what does the post-neoliberal moment mean? Well, I think there are a few challenges that it really poses. So first, we've seen our immigration model completely uprooted, basically. So if we are truly moving to a moment where we are going to do interior enforcement against daycares, against construction sites, against restaurant workers, well, many people will return to their home country. If we are moving to a model with less immigrant labor, well, maybe that will mean we will raise wages in these sectors. But this is happening at a moment where for both left and right, the central question is affordability. And affordability of care is going to be a huge issue. So what are we going to do? Are we going to reduce immigrant labor, raise wages, and sell to the public that we are making these services more affordable, more accessible? That is a huge tension. Now, I think that there are also real questions about the path forward. So what are our choices? Well, I sort of see three possible ways that you can think about this. The first is simply, well, we just need to deepen and make more efficient markets. So, well, maybe the problem in the past with immigration is we let, immigrants come regardless of what sector they were working in. If we have more precise guest worker visas for care workers or in the construction industry, well, we can continue to sustain a similar immigrant model, fueling our care economy and shaping how we raise our families. Perhaps. A second model is obviously automation. Maybe where we're moving is we reduce immigration and we replace much of that work with some version of robot care assistants. I don't think that's a model that appeals to very many of us, but it is true that in these discussions about the trade-offs between immigrants and tighter labor markets, we forget that automation is also one of the big paths ahead and likely to affect care industries as well. And then I think the third bigger question, which maybe Anne-Marie will comment on, is also what does the kind of post-market care world look like? What does it really mean to move beyond the neoliberal model of providing care through this market-based economy? I think on both left and right, we're seeing a demand for those types of rethinking. How do we create better community supports for families? How do we involve more people in the parenting process? I think that how do we think about intergenerational households and the role that they're going to play in the future? How do we change our housing policy to kind of support those types of choices and those potentially harder to monetize economies? So I think they're very big questions ahead. I think at the moment, as we see the global backlash against immigration, we actually know more on where immigration policy is going and the sort of restrictiveness that the post-neoliberal moment might bring than we know about how are we going to rethink family policy and parenting when we can no longer rely on the cheap service economy that sustained our neoliberal family model.
Thank you. So I want to come at this a little differently. I'm not an economist. We've spent a lot of time talking about how the economy works and how it works for immigrants and how it doesn't for families. And so first I want to say that I'm an Iraqi immigrant. I came to this country when I was 9 years old. I knew the words yes, no, please, and thank you, and that's it. I arrived on December 13th, 1978, to an America that looked, completely different than the America of today. And so I take to be the affliction, the issue, not just of families, but of immigration, migration, however you want to say it, and immigrant families themselves, as the lack of a cohesive cultural identity in this country. When I came to this country and I went to school and I learned how to be an American, how to appreciate this country, not everything, but to understand and to be able to think about what it means to be an American, what it means to be a person, what it means to be a family and a society. I can go on about the difficulties about today's assimilation and integration versus my own assimilation and integration. Now, migration in itself, within itself, is a dislocation. Okay, it is an uprootedness, and it causes a lot of wounds in the human person. We've talked a lot today about being holistic and approaching these problems holistically. Well, it wounds you as a person to undergo that process. So when then you go into a culture that is itself uprooted, as today's American culture is, then you have, so Simone Weil talks about how the number one need for the human soul is rootedness, right? And she talks about uprootedness and what that does to the human person. And she talks about the unemployed, experiencing uprootedness to the second power. And I'm here to say that when an immigrant comes into a country who can't even agree on what it means to be just an American or what it means to be a human person, right? They experience that immigrant, migrant, whatever you want to call them, that person experiences an uprootedness to the second power. So now they don't know who they are, to where and to whom they belong, and how do they enter into this society. Now, when they get told, like when my parents they went and when they had their swearing in, and I remember my parents coming home and my mom telling me, see, I told you, I don't have to be an American. They told me I can keep my traditions and I can keep my culture and I can just be who I am. And my difficulty has always been, and I was still young at that time, and my difficulty was, how will you live in the society? How will we as a society come together? How can we have common ground? And I just want to take a minute because this is a question that was raised earlier about what it means to be an American. Well, I think Lincoln gives us a skeletal image, model for what it means to be an American. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read this. This is from his July 1958 Chicago speech. Very moving, and I hope I won't tear up because I usually do when I read it. So he's talking about new immigrants here and how they are trying to fit in. If they look back through their history to trace their connection with those days by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to these men, that it is the father of all moral principles in them, and that they have a right to claim it as if they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. And so they are. That is the electric cord in that declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together. That will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. And what you hear, what Lincoln says, that old Declaration of Independence, that moral principle, and those moral principles that we can draw from just that small segment of Lincoln is that there is a creator, that all men are created equal, and that through this creation, man has what we call human dignity.
Thank you, Luma.
Wow, thank you. I think you meant 1858.
Yes.
What
did I say?
I suddenly got very confused.
It was 1850, July 1858. That's right.
I was thinking, wait a minute, who in 1958 would have given that speech? But thank you. So it has been a head-spinning day in all the ways I think that Danielle and Jen and Larry Kramer originally would have wanted it to be. And I really understood that when I heard, Americans are allergic to regulation as a negative coming from somebody from the Heritage Foundation. And I thought, wait a minute, what universe are we in? But this is exactly the kinds of intersections I think it's exciting to hear, and I just sort of wonder, what would it be like all day if we didn't know where people were from? I mean, if there was just no presumption whatsoever and you just heard what they said. One of the areas I find of greatest overlap, at least in reading, between left and right, we'll put them in quotes, is exactly concern for the health of the family. I read lots of things on the right, and I feel like I could write lots of them myself. In fact, I have. And for me, the health of the family is the measure, should be the measure, in part, it's not the only measure, but it should be a critical measure of the health of our economy. I think family policy is economic policy, and of our society more broadly. So I think I get there a different way, although I certainly, as a mother, resonate with your points about accessing porn in particular. So I come at this, I'm a law professor originally and a political scientist, and I study foreign policy. I got to where I am now I'm a strong feminist, looking at gender equality, looking at why is it that we don't value traditional women's work of care as much as we value traditional men's work of breadwinning, and really thinking, well, we have to value that work. That, though, really takes you to, at least for me, to this idea of a holistic person. And I introduced it briefly this morning. I just want to say a little bit more about it. I do think ideas of human nature are at the root of one of the biggest differences between neoliberalism and whatever is coming. So Margaret Levy, whom you heard from earlier, and Alison Gopnik had a workshop at the Stanford Institute for Advanced Behavioral Studies on the social science of caregiving. There were neuroscientists and biologists and sociologists and psychologists across the board. And a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Garlow, and I wrote a paper in Daedalus this February that really looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you heard somebody reference Maslow earlier. And in case you remember, it's basic needs. You've got to have safety. You've got to have food and shelter. Then there's love and belonging. And then at the top, there's self-actualization. Well, he was a sociologist. That is certainly not grounded in any science. And we heard that today, actually, where human beings cannot survive without connection and care. It's not just that we're social animals, it's just a basic point. And our brains require that connection and care. And we know that too, because if you try to raise a child without any kind of connection, even if you satisfy physical needs, it won't work. So suppose we imagine human beings as needing connection and separation equally. I am not so if we thought of a human being, you need connection, because you can't survive. You also need separation, because anybody who's had teenagers, that is part of human development, right? You have to separate. Actually, terrible twos will do as well. But so you need both connection and separation. You need a relational identity and an individual identity. As a woman, as a feminist, I fought against being defined as a mother, daughter, sister, wife. My father, I wanted to be me. I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be all sorts of things. But once I got to those things, I wasn't about to give up mother, daughter, sister, wife. That connection is every bit as important. And the whole having it all debate is really about that. And men really have been shortchanged on the connection side, at least in our modern society, in my view. So you need a relational identity and an individual identity. You need interdependence and independence. And you need belonging and self-actualization. So instead of this hierarchy, suppose we thought of all of this as an equal set of needs. Suppose the Enlightenment had been designed by people who had caregiving responsibilities as well as people who could sit in their studies and write books. And I'm for both of those things. So what does that then means? Family is absolutely essential to our health, because we have an entire economy based on individual workers. So we look at unemployment, we look at GDP in terms of who has jobs and what they're making. That's economics. Family policy is over there in this backwater. But that's completely wrong. Strong societies are societies that enable people to care for one another, that enable people to provide resilience, emotional resilience, financial resilience, that enable people to satisfy those needs for connection. And I think of it as a biological or a chosen family. It's groups of people who are deeply committed to caring for one another. So from that perspective, and again, it's not either or. It is both. But we would really overhaul the way we thought about what our economic policy and social policy ought to be doing. We would not think that families and the health of families and the health of communities, because connection goes basically families, friends, communities, nation, and indeed also the divine, to Emma's point, that's part of connection, as well as how well we're doing as individuals. That's how I think about the family. I want to just say then a word about immigration. Northern European Protestants, which is the origins of most of our nation for a long time, I think are pretty much the least family-oriented cultures in the world. That's not bad. I mean, they're Protestant work ethic. There are all sorts of good things. But as we become 50% European American and 49% European American and 51% coming from the rest of the world, and Americans under 30 will be there in 2 years. So in case you think this is far off in the future, you are looking at cultures that are far more family-oriented. You are looking at multi-generational cultures. Indra Nooyi, the head of Pepsi, once said, I could never have made it if it weren't for the Hindu multi-generational compound. She needed her family there to be able to do what she needed. You talk to many Latinos about how they're doing what they need to do. African Americans who have long, extended families, Indian Americans, Asian Americans of different kinds. So I will put to you, it doesn't matter about more immigration. It does, for all the reasons that Alicia said, but we are already becoming a family when our political power catches up with our demographic realities that will think about families very differently, but it needs to come sooner than that.
All right. You want to weigh in, Luma? Okay.
Yeah, I do, because so I agree. The difficulty is that when these immigrant families come in, what are they faced with, right? We all know that the kids go to school, and what are they learning at school, right? So the America I came to, I learned that there was still an importance in families. U.S. history was still getting taught, or at least a certain sense of patriotism was in the schools. There was a sense of morality in the public sphere and a sense of the transcendence, a sense of God, that even though not everybody was necessarily religious. But what happens today when these immigrant kids come? Well, they have two choices, right? Because if there's no real American identity to which they can assimilate and integrate, then what are they left with? Well, they're left with the shards that are getting taught in school, or they're left with their own, turning inward to their own enclaves. And what that does is it compounds the fracturing already present in our society. So that's what I meant by that uprootedness to the second power, and that kids in particular then, and then, either, especially you are correct about that the majority of immigrants that come today come from societies that value families way more now, still, more than, say, you could say some of the natural born, because we still have, we don't want to not say that they don't. But what happens then? Then they're exposed to a culture that doesn't value families, and so the kids will either radicalize one way or the other, or turn away and don't want to become American, or they will kind of enter into that separation, the atomization, the rejection of family, the rejection of the religions, whatever that religion is, the religion of their families and their society. So there's a huge problem. That assimilation integration problem actually goes both ways. We as America are not providing a cohesive culture to immigrate into, and they are having a hard time entering into and becoming part of the peoplehood. That's the ultimate thing, is peoplehood.
Let me jump in for a second. No. Thank you. And I know, Brad, you want to get into, so I'll pull you in a second. Although I'm also going to come back to you, Alicia. So I think, Alicia, you did really the helpful job of articulating the market-driven neoliberal approach to immigration, which then actually turned out to be a sort of form of family policy too. We didn't necessarily know it, but essentially the notion that maximize migration as a way of lifting standards of living, addressing poverty across the whole globe, as well as increasing productivity domestically, and not caring so much about allocation or how it's rearranging social forms. And now we sort of look and see that, okay, it was family policy, it rearranged social forms and the like. And I think along this couch, what we have then is a set of different moral frameworks for evaluating the consequences of that family policy. Technology coming in as like another accidental driver of family policy. And I'm sort of hearing a very strong appetite from everybody to reclaim a kind of positive vision about what well-being for families would be, and to try to figure out what pro-family supportive policy might be, but also, a lot of complicated questions, right? So, in other words, Alicia, you put on the table the fact that if you don't bring a kind of market-driven rationality to immigration, if we have a sort of moral lens instead, and maybe it's the vision of freedom is attractive. We have to recognize that freedom is attractive. People will come here, period, always, because freedom is attractive, and therefore we need a rational immigration policy, enforceable. But we also have to expect that people will come, and we need to be ready to accept them into that project of freedom. But then that, sort of different levels of it drives wages up. We think that's a good thing. And then we have the affordability question. So I'm going to ask you ultimately, Alicia, sort of how do you think about that? Are there any other solutions? Alongside that is the complicated problem of, we're talking here too about how sort of public sector supports and civil society supports and market supports kind of interact with each other. And there can be a worry that in that moment where we, sort of lift the value of labor what we end up also doing is relying more on the home as a sort of care location, and then does that erode the gains that women have made in sort of the job sort of employment context? So Alicia, I'd like you to address those questions, how you think we might puzzle through those things, and then Brad, to come back to you, you started to sort of spell out a picture of family supportive policy. I'd be glad to have you sort of take a few more beats on that and bring in any specific policies you see on the horizon. And again, there too, we have a puzzle, right? I mean, sort of talking about families as information gatekeepers. How can we protect kids from revenge porn, but also make sure that LGBTQ kids do have access to information that they might need? Is there a way of, dealing with that particular puzzle? So, Alicia, if you could take those puzzles first, and then Brad, you can take the puzzles that I gave you and others that you have in mind.
Sure, that was a great way to synthesize a complex set of debates. Let me just say two things, and I should say my own thinking is very undecided on these questions. But what is the sort of post-neoliberal model of immigration and care look like? I think we could actually imagine two very different types of new immigration scenarios. So the first is not surprising, but I want to emphasize that there are a lot of people around the world who do not want to come and stay in the United States. They want to come for a few years. They want to experience the United States. They would love to be here in their 20s and learn English and be in a different culture. And they also maybe have wonderful family-oriented cultures and friends and social networks in the countries they come from. And frankly, they get stuck here because of our immigration policy, because it is so hard to get in that you don't dare leave and see what it's like to go back to your home country. So the first thing we can imagine are more opportunities for circular short-term migration. Things, and it's not perfect, but our au pair program, things like our agricultural guest worker program, reimagined better, but nonetheless recognizing that there is a demand to come here for a short period of time that can integrate with our care needs, our service needs in our economy. And then the second very different proposal is really to think much more about community-driven immigration. So really thinking about communities that are sponsoring immigrants, that are those that are thinking about what are the needs that we have. Do we need a rural doctor? Do we need elderly care workers in our town? Can we think about giving more local control to communities in driving immigration levels and policy? And I think that both of those things would be consistent with a shifting model that isn't so much about levels, but is trying to think about the ways in which we integrate immigrants into our communities. And I would say, maybe that community-driven model is also the space to really think about what our integration project looks like. And obviously there is a national integration project, but there is also a community one that's extremely important and central to actually thinking about the way that we strengthen our social networks and families. So those are two very different looking kind of policy options in this immigration space, I'd say. Now, the second issue is sort of how do we make sure whatever more community care model that we can envision, a less marketized model, doesn't erode the gains that women have made in the workforce? That's, to me, a big, big question. And I'd say here also, it's something that I often, wonder about, and even thinking, Anne-Marie has done so much to make care and the care economy and the valuation of care work to be part of the debate and the political debate. And sometimes that feels like, okay, so what we're trying to do is marketize care work. How much is this non-market care work actually worth in the market? But of course, there's another way of saying, no, care is something fundamentally different.
Labor of love.
A labor of love. And what people want is to think that, I don't need to pay somebody to come and check that my kid is okay. I just want a neighbor who cares that my kid is okay. I don't want to have to send my kid to summer camp and pay a bunch of counselors I don't know. I just want all of my neighbors to have their kids at home during the summer so they can run around and ride bikes together. Well, those are models that still could support the female entrance into the labor force, but it is a lot of female labor that will be involved in building the communities that support a different non-market model of raising families. And the last plug I would just say is I hope technology helps us get there rather than prevents it. Because obviously the easy resolution is to say, well, if I can't, pay for my kid to go have a babysitter every day and go to after school enrichment classes, well, at least she can sit on her iPad and just, watch whatever AI tutoring content is coming at her. That's not the world we want either. We want technology that means that it's not mothers who have to organize summer camp for their kids and after school activities so they're riding their bike together. We would like an app that would actually do that, or we would like different technological supports that could enable greater community, greater solidarity in raising families. And I hope we can get there, and I think that world could be consistent with 2-career families and all the sorts of aspirations that we hope our sons and daughters will have.
Yeah, Alicia, you kind of went to a point that was somewhere I wanted to go that I think synthesizes some of the things that have been raised here, which is we need to remember when we talk about family policy that the first thing that comes to our minds as Northern European Protestants is the nuclear family in this very small sense of father, mother, 1.6 children, right? But of course, when you say most cultures are way more pro-family, they also have a much more capacious sense of what the family is, right? The family is this very extended family network, often kinship networks, and where Northern European Protestants may not have had that extended family so much defined through kinship networks, they still had it through the family of the church family. The local community was this sort of extended family that participated in the task of care. And I think, Alicia, I'm sure this is, I'm sure someone has made this argument somewhere before, but it strikes me, your narrative about immigration facilitating this sort of outsourcing of the care economy. I mean, I think one thing that all this immigration did was by providing all these low-income, low-cost care workers, is it really helped accelerate that deactivation of the extended family as a care network. And so we were able to start functioning as these atomized nuclear families that then just paid for whatever care needs we had, rather than relying on grandma, cousins, neighbors, friends from church, et cetera. And I think, this relates to some of Luma's points that in terms of that assimilation, part of how that assimilation happens is by a family being nested within that sort of extended family of a community that actually looks out for one another and that helps enculturate immigrants into what it means to be an American. And part of what we're dealing with is, since those community structures no longer exist, since we're all bowling alone, as Robert Putnam has said, that makes that assimilation much more difficult. And this gets to, the question raised for me about, well, okay, the concern about the parents being information gatekeepers, what about those LGBT youth who might commit suicide if they have no access to any other sources of information? And I think the problem is this presupposes a world in which it is all or nothing. Like, the only sources of information you have are your two parents, or else the entire world, right? Like literally anyone in the world giving your child information. And this is bizarre in historical terms, right? I mean, historically, children grew up in these concentric circles, right? Where they had their parents were the primary information gatekeepers, but they also, spent time with aunts and uncles and extended family who might tell the kids things that the parents, didn't tell them. And then, they could play
I
at the
definitely did.
They could play at the park with friends who were, still within the kind of circle of trust, because these were all kids that the families went to church with or whatever, right? And so kids did have access to other sources of information. But what we've done is, and Jonathan Haidt chronicles this really well in the Ancient Generations, we simultaneously collapsed all those other forms of social embedding, all those other ways in which children were interfacing with other people out there in the physical world. We got rid of those, and then we put them online, and when we gave them unfettered access to everything, right? So I am not suggesting a world in which, parents simply just kind of lock down and protect their kids against anything that those two parents don't want them to know. I'm suggesting a world in which we reintegrate families into intergenerational communities, so that children sort of can naturally grow into more and more knowledge about the world as they're ready for it. And just, sorry, very briefly, you asked for a particular policy thing. One thing I'd throw out here, an idea I've had that I don't know if it has any takers, but we have the child tax credit. What if we had an in-home care tax credit, right? So if you had elderly parents that you actually cared for at home, you get the same tax credit or bigger tax credit than for caring for children, right? Something to incentivize actually intergenerational care again.
There's another policy idea that's come in on Slido, so I will read it. But I also want to just say, so please do. People have been sending questions in, and I've been integrating them here in this conversation. But please, this next 15 minutes is for all of you to share questions. So a policy idea coming from all of you. To have community bandwidth to raise kids, we need more free time. The morning's question shouldn't be work or not work. We should want 30-hour work weeks with AI. So there's an interesting direction for driving AI policy towards 30-hour work. I like that one.
Totally.
I do. Now, and I'll need somebody else to tell me, can we do that, and how can we do that? But I like it. So a few other policy ideas came up and are connected to this conversation, even from earlier. Rob Watson made the point that in order for communities to share power around solving problems like crime or child poverty and the like, they actually needed more physical infrastructure, meeting spaces, places they can come together to deliberate and decide. There's a certain kind of potential public sector investment there that might be a policy. I think Alicia made a point about housing. I think we're hearing a sort of picture here of a future for this country of more multi-generational families again as a possible solution to the kind of economic challenges that we've faced, but that does mean different housing. There is, of course, the important housing policy spreading around the country right now of encouraging accessory dwelling units, right? A sort of mother-in-law, units in a backyard. That's been introduced as a kind of affordability policy, right? But actually, it might, in fact, also be a pro-family policy in a certain kind of way. So that's a question for all of you to think about. If I jump in here too from the Slido, so there's a question here about outsourcing and expertise. Isn't there expertise required and now recognized for caring for the elderly and mentally or physically challenged that complicates the outsourcing arguments? So Anne Marie, maybe you could take that one.
I'll take that one. Let me just say two things in response to this conversation. I think we're shortchanging men here. I really do. We're not going to have a debate about biology and socialization, but for most of human history, yes, women took care of infants, but then little boys went out and worked with their fathers, and little girls worked with their mothers. They were homeschooled. I mean, this is so much of what we have today is a function of the Industrial Revolution. When people are at home, it's hard work. Let's just be very clear with kids or parents or anyone who needs care. But that's why I emphasize connection. We have an epidemic of loneliness and isolation in this country. A lot of that is men. The idea that men don't want to be connected in the same way and engaged with their families, I think is just wrong. And so many men are locked into structures of work that are not the ones they designed either, which goes to the larger issue. I think we need structures, institutions for care and connection and community in the same way that we have them for competition. So absolutely we don't have that infrastructure, but we can build it. And if we build it at the community level and it's about the community and people are around, fine. But I do, we still reflexively think women, some women are much more ambitious and really want to be working all the time. If you've seen The Pit, the female surgeons are just as driven as the men. It should be more personality than gender. But coming to the specific question, and Margaret, I'm glad you asked it. We've been so often when we talk about families, we think about kids and we don't think about elders. I'm the height of the baby boom, and every conversation I have with my friends is really about our aging parents. For those of us, many of us still have our parents. And there actually technology can help, because on the dignity factor, there are a lot of things that you'd rather have a robot be able to do. And then there are a lot of things you still really need human connection. And again, that helps your brain. That helps you keep yourself in the best mental health you can. There's a lot of knowledge required at both ends, right? To take care of children in ways that develop their brains appropriately at different stages it takes a lot of knowledge. People who study that and can do it professionally, I'm not saying mothers can't or fathers can't, but ideally you'd have a blend, I think, or at least help for families and how they care for their children and for elders, absolutely. And that's part of then making sure that care jobs are well-compensated jobs, but that goes exactly back to Alicia's point of, well, wait a minute, childcare is radically unaffordable, so is elder care, so what are we gonna do? So that means, to me, state investment in a number of, not safety net, but universal health care, radically lowering the cost of education, lowering the cost of housing, and then, yes, a different use of time. We could have 30 hours of paid work. We would certainly have 30 hours of unpaid work, but we would not necessarily experience it as work.
I'm going to shift gears slightly, Luma, to come back to you again, because a theme of this whole conversation is about communities and the supports communities need, both for care and also for supporting development. I mean, I think, have given a lot of thought to the question of the incorporation of migrants into the American context. What do you see as sort of pro-community policies that could support incorporation?
I mean, first of all, the thing about immigrant communities is they do for their own, right? In terms of they are already, in many ways, they are already living the very sort of policies that we've seen around this panel discussed during the day. So you have, I live about a mile from my parents, and I moved that close in order to be able to be of help to them, because very soon I'm going to need to do that, and I still have my own children, so I'm at that stage, exactly. So most immigrant families are taking care of their elders. They are taking care of the children. They live in multi-generationally, and so on and so forth. And so you can sort of study that and say, so how can we then learn from these immigrant communities who are already doing these things on the local level, and then through their churches or mosques or whatnot. But then the flip side is you have the very real danger that I've seen and experienced of then immigrants turning around and adopting the very atomization and the very sort of the kind of, because independence of itself is good, a sort of destructive independence that works its way in, and then they don't want to take care of their parents, and then they don't want to do those things. But everything that's been said, about housing or about care, and we should not neglect the fact that there are many natural-born Americans who want to be able to go back to more community living, and we need to find a way. I'm not an economist, so those people have to find a way to make that happen. With the cost of housing, the cost of care, and so on. I love the idea about an elder credit, or whatever, however you phrase
Elder
that.
care tax credit.
Elder care. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
And 40% of people doing elder care are men, in part because their sisters or their wives either not there or won't do it.
So I set up this panel this way because I had an intuition that discussions about the family and discussions about migration belong together. And I think we have found precisely how they do belong together, precisely because the care economy is at the intersection of those two things, and the care economy is at the center of how work is structured. and therefore at the center of the whole economy. So I first of all want to say thank you to the panelists for helping to bring out how these themes are connected. And for our few remaining minutes, I'm just going to go ahead and go down the line and invite each of you to share whatever your kind of closing reflection is, the sort of thought you'd like to leave this room with as we wrap up.
No, me first again?
Yep.
Oh, great.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that tying this in with some of the conversations earlier and just seeing some of the questions on the screen, I do think that part of this, a lot of this does require getting out of the two-income trap, right? Giving families the flexibility to have one spouse stay at home for at least a period of the children growing up or for elder care purposes, rather than having both spouses being locked into the workforce, for most of their adult life in order to make ends meet. And I think many of you probably saw the viral Substack that went around a couple weeks ago, for the sort of $140,000 poverty line, which was a provocative title, but made a very important set of arguments about just how, essentially between $40,000 a year and $140,000 a year, it's actually hard to make any forward progress because of the way the benefits are structured and the way that the cost of childcare is structured and so on and so forth. And so I think we really do need to revisit some of those incentives. I think, my boss, Oren Cass, who was speaking earlier, of course, is would emphasize always the importance of the kind of the worker power side of the equation so that we can actually get back to a situation where one wage is enough to raise a family. And then I think that then unlocks a lot of possibilities for because as I think one of the questions on the screen noted, it's a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to build community, and nobody has that time anymore if both spouses are working full time. So.
I think I'll build on that a little bit to say, there was discussion of how should we rethink, the classic consumption plus leisure is our, basic function. And, I think there's a way people said, well, we need to add work in there. We need to add care in there. We also still need to have leisure in there. And I think one model that I find really beautiful, and I think in general a theme in this panel is also, you can actually learn a lot from immigrant communities. You can learn a lot from, the countries they're coming from. And one of my favorite models recently has been in Bogota, Colombia, a city I work in. They've really started this project of care blocks, which is the city government is basically organizing, first of all, care for caregivers. So you don't have time to go get your driver's license. You don't have time to take yourself to a doctor's appointment. We will care for the caregivers. So I think that's actually an incredibly important model, is to think about how, in this non-monetized work, you also think about leisure and the ability to support those caregivers. The other thing that I think is really interesting in that model is that it's connecting caregivers, right? And government can obviously change the prices of these services, make affordable, shape our choices. It can also create connections. And a lot of what we're talking about in terms of building community could be catalyzed by a government model that was experimenting with something like these caregiver blocks. Here is where I would say, come on, local and state government. You are our laboratories of innovation. Many of us who are maybe living in the state of Massachusetts would say, this is something where Massachusetts led on healthcare. Why are we not leading on the care economy? Why are we not thinking about these sorts of credits for caregivers? And, I think there are a lot of ways in which a more innovative care policy would really think about giving people the full range of options of, do you want center care? Do you want to do this at home? Do you want a policy that's going to, really promote to income households, or can we think about policies that leave that as a much more flexible choice, but support those caregivers and support the choices they're making? And I think there is much more for government to do and innovate on. And there was a question about why can't we get over our partisan divides on this? I'm not sure, but I would really call on local and state government to be the laboratories on this, because there are interesting models and they're happening all around the world that we could also be drawing on.
See, there was a question about cultural reform, and that will help reform the families and identity. So in answering that, I want to just leave with a couple of things. One is take seriously the American cultural identity crisis. Take that seriously and let us apply ourselves to it and not think that anybody who cares about American culture is some far-right loony, right? There are real questions here that need to be addressed. And so I would leave with that. I would say as well that don't necessarily reject the idea that not all immigrants come desiring to assimilate and to become American. That is a real thing. I live with that. I've lived with that. I see that. I've grown up with that. It is very real, and we need to find ways to deal with that. And then regarding cultural identity, the way to begin to reform cultural identity is, I would say, again, give God a chance. Give religion a chance. This is an element, this is I think it was Graham who talked about the lack of metaphysical just discussion. I mean, that's what should be undergirding everything. We're talking about all the stuff up here, but Bill, at bottom, we're talking about the who is the human person and who is God, and is there a God, and all these things. And these things need to be discussed seriously and not to be thought of, again, just, the ideas of some, far-right loony or something. And that is how we begin to change those things. And those things that Lincoln talked about, that he drew out of the Declaration of Independence.
So I will certainly second that last point and just say part of the work that Danielle does and many in this room is civic education, which I think we all also deeply agree on. I'd leave you with one thought, which is this is really both and, right? So often here, there's a romanticization of family and community. There was a question about families that are forged by violence. There are many of us who, moved away, did not really found their families to be deeply restrictive, and communities for sure. I mean, so I think it's very important to realize that just as I talk about connection and separation, or belonging and self-actualization, we should be thinking of those as complements, and we should recognize that, pro-family policy does not mean you're venerating the family and the community as the ultimate. It means these are really important parts of human experience. This is necessary for human flourishing. And so too is the ability to be the person that you feel that you uniquely are. And our economic and social policy is very skewed on one side of that. And we ought to be thinking about both.
Thank you so much. I want to say as we close, too, that there was a good question about how can mental health care be a part of the care economy. I wanted to voice that out loud because it is a really important part of the conversation. I'm sorry we didn't get to it. After we close, we'll have some closing remarks from Yochai Benkler and then a great reception. So a little bit more, but thank you for your great attention, and let's thank this panel.